spring practice is either halfway or over halfway through for most teams out there. And so we got a lot of scoop that I wanted to get to as much as we can in this show tonight, like at Texas, for example. The quarterback room, they feel, could be the best in the country, with Quinn Ewers and then behind him, Arch Manning. And that's with Malik Murphy leaving. They still feel like they could go at least 1-2 with anyone in the country. And I'm not going to argue with it. They certainly are up there. I mean, and I think Quinn Ewers, in a different conversation, probably is one of the most important players in college football this year, because if he advances, it's the same thing with Carson Beck at Georgia. Like, if those guys progress, if they are better players this year than they were last year, it's the most common sense thing to argue. If your quarterback gets better, you get better. But it's never a guarantee. Just because a guy's returning in this sport does not mean you automatically get 10 or 15 or 20% better. But if he does, the next most interesting thing coming out of Texas, and Chip Brown has a lot over at Horns 24/7 right now that I would strongly encourage you guys to go read, is Isaiah Bond and DeAndre Moore are two receivers they picked up out of the portal. And you know what? Nyblack, the tight end, he and Bond were both at Alabama last year. Those are non-negotiables. Like, those guys have to pan out for them, and they feel like they are. And DeAndre Moore was from Houston. So far, albeit through spring practice, so far they're kind of cautiously checking those boxes. Like, we hit on him. We hit on him. I think at defensive tackle, with the amount of talent they lost, especially in run-stopping potential, they're probably not solidified there. My best guess is if Texas is active in the portal post-spring, which they will be because everyone will be, defensive tackle will probably be something to keep an eye on with Texas. But it's the fastest receiver room they've probably had under Sark, and maybe the fastest receiver room that Texas has ever had. That's not a guarantee of anything other than guys are going to run really fast, but it is a nice weapon to have at your disposal. Let's go up to Penn State. The Fighting Jessies up at Penn State. What's happening there? We hadn't talked a lot about Penn State this spring. Well, much as is the case with Texas, they wanted to get more explosive, and Penn State really, really needed to get more explosive. So they added Andy Kotelnicki. That was the offensive coordinator at Kansas last year. And James Franklin looked around and said, we don't push the ball down the field enough. And he was right. And you all said it too, not just him. If you watched the Michigan game last year, non-existent. If you watched the Ohio State game last year, non-existent. There's zero fear of them ever stretching the field. So they wanted to address that. And they went and they hired a new offensive coordinator, and there is a premium emphasis being put on that. And not surprisingly, it's been a focus point. Therefore, they've been improved. Penn State has to significantly improve, I think, in that category for them to make a run this year. But Julian Fleming, you remember that name once upon a time, I believe, out of the state of Pennsylvania. He goes to Ohio State. He's one of like 25-star receivers there, and then goes back and transfers to Penn State. He's had a good spring. That's very encouraging to hear, because he's had a good spring, and A.J. Harris, who was a corner at Georgia by way of Central and Phoenix City High School, he transferred up there, and both those guys have drawn really, really good reviews. Talking to Tyler Donahue of Lions 24/7, and he's always got his ear to the ground up there. They covered Penn State very, very well. And those two names, like, that's who you should be focused on if you're trying to gauge how good Penn State could be this year. They're good, but also Abdul Carter, who's a mainstay there, was kind of given a choice. Like, you have such a versatile skill set. Where do you want to play? He's been at linebacker, moved to defensive end. And he's going to tear it up there, and the NFL will love that. They don't lack names in the linebacker room. The proven production and the dependable top-line depth, it's not a weakness. It's a question I have that I'm not sure they've answered yet, and that's what God made spring practice for, as Meemaw once famously said. So that's kind of an ongoing thing that we're looking at there. At Georgia, mentioned just a second ago, Carson Beck, good player, really good player last year, could be a phenomenal player this year. Carson Beck did not flirt with NFL, flirt with college, come back and just kind of dip a toe into the water. When he came back, he dove back in, and it's a huge year for him individually, For Georgia, every year is a huge year, but when we were down there last month, I mean, you talk to any staffer at Georgia, and the first thing out of their mouth, like I could ask the defensive line coaches about their position rooms, and the first thing out of their mouth would be, well, first off, getting Carson Beck back was huge. Now let's talk about our guys. So they all know. Like in that building, they all know how big that is. Everything I think that you're hearing about him from a hype standpoint is valid. So there's that. In the receiver room, they added a kid by the name of Colby Young out of Miami via the portal. He's been really good this spring. I think they'll be able to count on him, not to provide depth. Like he could be a go-to option for them. The defensive line, we talked to Kirby about it when we had him on the show a few weeks ago. And he said depth and then, dependability, top-line talent on the defensive line. Are we there? They weren't there by Georgia standards last year. Still very good, but not elite by Georgia standards. And I'm not saying they couldn't be this year. I think that unit has a ways to go. Wouldn't shock me if they were active there, just as Texas is probably going to be in the portal post-spring. But Ben Wolk and Jordan Hill over at Dogs 24/7, practice reports every other day throughout the spring. That's something that I think you're going to hear a lot about in summer workouts individually. They get in fall camp. Defensive line. Like ultimately when Georgia tees it up. I think they open against Clemson, I want to say. That'll be a thing to watch. And also at Virginia Tech, since we were there last week, but I didn't get to talk to you about it, we had really interesting feedback when we had Brent Pry on the show. And he said, this place was Clemson before Clemson was Clemson. And some people took that literally. And therefore, they felt the need to point out, well, Clemson had national championship under their belt before Frank Beamer even ever showed up at Pate. I think he meant in the modern era, or the modern era, as some would say. Clemson kind of came to be a superpower in the modern era. But what he was saying was before that, it was Virginia Tech rattling off conference championships, being a perennial title contender. And that's how they're selling the vision of the program to recruits. And I do the same thing, so I didn't disagree with him there. However, recruiting from an infrastructure and talent acquisition standpoint was very lackluster when they walked in. And that's not an overnight fix. So still with Virginia Tech, you're going to ask, well, where are the top-line guys? Well, some of them are there, but many of them have come from the portal. Kyron Drones is their quarterback, came from the portal. And he could be a very special player this fall. I got to watch practice when we were there last week, and he's impressive, man. They're very excited about him. It's tempered, as is most excitement in spring with coaches. But, if things break right for them, they got a promising receiver room there as well. He could be a very good player this year. But Sam Brumfield is a linebacker that came there from Middle Tennessee. Copeland is the defensive lineman from JUCO. Those two stood out. Look, when you watch practice, those two stood out. And then, listening to Colby Crawford, who does a really good job with VT Scoop, by the way, those are two of the names that he spotlighted. So that wasn't just a one-day thing. When I'm up there, those guys didn't just happen to pop, which sometimes happens. I'll ask a coach about a guy I saw last week. He'll say, who? Oh, no, he's running with the threes. What are you talking about? Well, those two could be difference makers for Virginia Tech. So just some things that we're hearing from spring practice. It's always one of my favorite segments to do. Spring Scoop. It's rivaled only with fall practice intel. When we get to those first scrimmages of fall camp and the depth chart starts really getting sorted out.